So this is the N3 Ultra, and for those of you who have stumbled randomly onto this video and wondering what the heck, a music player with what? It uses vacuum tubes. Yeah, it's an old school music player. All it does is play music off a micro SD card pretty much. And it uses things like what used to be in your grandfather's radio kind of deal, except smaller than this obviously. This is just a 6SN7. Yeah, it says CV181, alternate name. British name, I remember, if I recall correctly. Or you can get smaller tubes like this 12AU7, which don't fit in here either. What actually goes in here, even smaller still, are sub-miniature tubes. This is a sub-miniature tube, which I actually have for a different device altogether. There's actually this old amp from ALO, Continental V5, for those of you who have been around a long while. And a couple of these are stuck in the side of this, and which is sitting behind this window. And actually when they're running, you'll see a yellow glow, but it's not actually from the tube because they don't glow much. They actually have an LED in there. Actually, this has an LED, although it's blue, and you can actually see a very faint tube glow in there from this. But it's not bright enough to really see through these side windows. And to stop it, like the tube making a ringing sound when you're listening, they damp them very heavily. So that's why you probably have a couple of LED lights in there. I'll show you that later. Anyhow, yeah, a music player. Actually, speaking of tubes, these are Horizon tubes from PSVANE, or PSVANE, as they're well known. PSVANE are sponsoring my videos this month, and they have their new Horizon series of tubes. And these are designed to be brand new tubes, because new old stock tubes, that is tubes going back decades, which are still brand new. You can still get them. You know, the transistor came out at just the right time when they'd made an absolute heap of tubes, are starting to get kind of expensive, and having a reliable source of inexpensive tubes is, well, a useful thing. And so they designed the Horizon series, and you can get them at, compared to some new old stock tubes, get them at a reasonable price. Actually, these two tubes, the 6SN7 and the 12AU7, I've reviewed, and you'll see a little card appear up there, and also in the description you can check out that video. So thank you to PSVANE for sponsoring this video. So anyway, back to the player. This is the N3 Ultra. And of course, as I said, it's pretty basic. If I go back to the front screen, I've made the text as large as possible in Android in this so you can see it. So actually it's a little bit less neat than it might normally be. All it does is you put a micro SD card in there with music, and it will play back that music. Actually, there's only one other mode it can function in, really, and that is if you plug it in via USB to say something like a phone or a computer, which I've done. And in that, you can use it as an external, like DAC or DAC amp, or essentially a large battery-powered dongle. Actually, we saw something like that with the Tube Mini recently. You can check out the review of that too, and I'll put a card up in the corner. This uses two of these little sub-miniature vacuum tubes. You can probably just see them in there. But you plug it in via USB to your computer, or phone actually, and it will power headphones, although it's not really designed for in-ear monitors, as I talked about in that review. And I actually compared these as well, so we're going to talk about that. While you don't have this basic software interface, well, you still do have a basic software interface, you have one based on Android now. So if I tap on Artist, you actually get, well, pretty much the same kind of view, as it's basically using the same kind of interface as the N3 Pro, but the cool thing is albums look way better. But you have a little bit of a larger viewing screen. Actually, the funny thing is this keeps its view. It still looks sharp. You can still see it clearly, even if I tilt this a lot. This one is interesting. Actually, where I'm sitting, this looks faded. I get to see, excuse the light, I get to see something like that. Only if you tilt it much further, then it becomes sharp again. So it's got a little bit, the screen's not quite as good in some respects. It has more pixels, but I think it's a 1280 screen, but I think it's not, well, at least sideways, but it's not quite as clear if you're looking at it at an angle. It actually, unlike the Pro, it doesn't have Bluetooth and it doesn't have Wi-Fi. So it's not even got a clock. It's just a player. It's from a computer or from a micro SD card, and that's it. You do have a little bit left. You do have a couple of EQ options, your standard EQ, because you've got the hobby music player running all this. So you can do all that. I don't want that on. Those random things. And you have a parametric EQ where you can set up to 9 bands of, bass shelf, treble shelf, or just whatever, with the Q value, which is the width and how much gain. You often see people now mention, oh, you should try this particular parametric EQ settings for particular headphones or in-ear monitors or stuff, you can do all that too. So other than that, if we go to the settings, you have a couple of useful options, and one of those is you can set the buttons on the side. Power button's now on the top, but you can set whether the buttons on the side, the volume control or the playback controls, will work when the screen is off, basically in the lock screen button settings. And you have a couple of audio settings, which people will be familiar with those. The main ones about the tubes I'll talk about separately, but you can set the balanced output to be a balanced line output as well. And so if you use a 4.4mm to dual 3-pin XLR cable, you can set that to be a line out as well for a balanced system, like a balanced headphone amp. And of course, it has a separate line out for the 3.5mm, I think with a separate circuit. So other than that, the good thing about having Android is you have like all the languages available in Android if you want them, other than like the half a dozen that you had in the N3 Pro. So that was pretty much, it doesn't have much, obviously, in terms of settings. The audio settings are what's in the Hobby Music Player. So if you've used the Hobby Music Player, you have pretty much what's in there. Things like resume play from last position, track transitions gapless or whatever, and replay gain. And you also have the options for, if you actually can connect this to a separate device as just a transport, and then use something like a Mojo or a Hugo 2 as your DAC, so you can do that as well. But that's pretty much all that's left. Other than that, you have your usual Hobby Music Player, which you can even has folder view as well, which is really handy. And there's no internal memory, you've got to use a micro SD card. But it does the job, and I don't mind the Hobby Music Player. It tells you if you've got high-res tracks, it tells you if you've got DSD tracks. I don't know, there's one DSD will show up easily here. There's like a couple of DSD ones floating around somewhere. And the useful thing is, this is version 1.3 of the software. You now have search, and search will show up basically anywhere in, if I view artist maybe, there's now a search button. Actually, there wasn't in version 1.0, 1.1, 1.2. So if I search, there's recent search. I can search for my favorite artists, and you can probably tell that I could do with sorting out a few things about my tracks. Dave Brubeck Quartet, the Dave Brubeck Quartet. Yeah, I should do some updating there. It's very basic. That's the only player you can use is what's on there. You can't load anything else on. We're back to the 2000s, basically. But, of course, with much better speed and much more larger music capacity and, DSD and high res and all that kind of thing, if you're into that. Before I get into my listening impressions, I'd like to talk about the connectors on this player. Now, if you're someone new to these kinds of players, this will give you some information about why it has a strange connector on one side. And if you are familiar with all these kind of connectors, it'll maybe give you a little bit of extra information you didn't already know. Now, of course, as a normal player, it has a 3.5mm headphone socket and a 3.5mm line out, and that's your standard headphone connector. It also has what's called a 4.4mm Pentacon socket. And this thing, and I have one in an adapter here, this is it has actually Pentacon as in 5. It has 5 connection points on there, and it's designed to carry, well, they call it balanced audio. That is audio where if you look at a normal connector, such as a 3.5mm connector, it has a left positive, a right positive, and then the signal return for both. This connector has separate signal returns for the left and the right, and then a separate ground connector. Now, balanced audio is a bit of a tricky thing, and I don't want to get into too much detail, but it was hyped up over a decade ago by a particular manufacturer that, well, has now gone, but in that it became very hyped when Astle and Kern started putting balanced audio in their portable players. I think it was the AK120 that was the first that had that. I could be wrong, or maybe one of the later ones, or maybe the 240. But all the same, it's something that's used in pro audio to reduce noise in very long cables that are used in, say, studio or say concert use especially, but is kind of, well, technically useless in portable audio. But because it was hyped up so much, it's pretty impossible to release anything remotely high-end in the portable world these days without it. Otherwise, people will just look at it as like, nah, that's no good. Even though the most resolving portable audio gear you can buy, this actually doesn't use balanced audio at all. So it's one of those things that kind of manufacturers have to have, and it means some advantages and disadvantages to the design of Cayin and other brands of products. So, and we're going to talk about that specifically. So the thing is, when you design an audio circuit specifically around balanced, and you plug in, say, a pair of single-ended headphones to the non-balanced socket, that's usually 3.5 or 6.3 millimeters, such as on amplifiers, then it doesn't sound as good very often because you're only using half the balanced circuit. And that means people get this false impression that balanced by default, therefore, is better because the balanced output sounds better in their amps or in their portable players. But in reality, it's to do with the design. If you used to be able to buy, say, the Astral & Kern AK320, which had just as good at balanced as single-ended circuit, and so you could plug in headphones to either, and it was basically identical because each of them was optimized for their own output. You don't have that in the Cayin gear. You actually have lower crosstalk, that is lower interference between the left and the right channels from the balance, that's the 4.4mm Pentacon socket, than you do the 3.5mm. And that means that the sound stage seems to be wider from the 4.4, whereas from the regular 3.5 it sounds narrower. Now, an interesting consequence of that has been with the N3 Pro. The N3 Pro, you could only use the tube mode from the 3.5mm socket. That means if you wanted the kind of proverbial wider sound stage, you only had could use solid state mode from the 4.4mm socket. But now you can use both tube mode and solid state mode from the 4.4mm socket. That means you get the best of both worlds. Actually, the funny consequence of having maybe the soundstage a little bit more closed in is that on some old music where they dumped, say, all the instruments either into the left or the right channel or the piano in the center, means that you do get a little bit more kind of a false crossfeed in there with the music, which can actually still sounds pretty okay. But it does mean you do get from the tube mode a potentially wider soundstage if you have headphones or earphones with that 4.4mm connector. Now, actually going from the N3 Pro to the N3 Ultra, even in solid state mode, there was a distinct jump up in clarity. I could hear more nuance in the music, and the soundstage seemed a touch wider in both single-ended and balanced modes. It's the 3.5mm or 4.4mm outputs, and that was a good thing. So there was definitely an improvement there. I also have compared it to a couple of other players. One of those is the FIO M11 Plus, and one actually is not a player, it's the recently reviewed Audio Tube Mini. We'll start with the Tube Mini because that is an interesting device. It is you could say a dongle DAC, a USB connected device, where it has vacuum tubes, the same ones that are inside the N3 Ultra, but connect via USB either to a phone or to a computer. Now, in its optimum mode, connected via USB-C or USB to a computer or something like my iPad or iPhone 15 Pro Max. The sound quality out of this Tube Mini versus the N3 Ultra was actually quite similar, at least with full-sized headphones. I'd probably give the nod to the Tube Mini versus the N3 Ultra in modern tube mode, with maybe a touch more nuance when using headphones such as the Dan Clark Audio E3s. Actually, for both of those, I had to set the volume to maximum for the E3s. There isn't really a huge amount of gain, and Cayin and FIO, for example, tend to set up their players so that they don't reach maximum power output and don't do things like start clipping. So it was just loud enough for this native DSD recording of Carmen Gomez, for example, which I've talked about before in previous videos, which is probably recorded maybe with more dynamic range and a little bit quieter than a lot of other recordings. Maybe for regular pop, actually, you could still get quite reasonably loud or not super loud with these relatively insensitive E3s. Of course, that's not going to be a problem with headphones such as the Meze Lyrics or things like the Meze 109 Pros, which are much more sensitive and you could use at a much lower volume level. But it was interesting that both were close to the same volume level at maximum, and that's maybe a limitation of maybe the kind of power you could have out of, say, a phone-sized device or a device that is designed to be able to use the maximum power a phone can output. Of course, the main disadvantage of having the Tube Mini is it does not work with in-ear monitors. It is, well, I talked about that in the review, but it is designed for full-sized headphones only. So probably for throwing something in which I'd use with a computer or phone, it'll be this with the Dan Clark Audio E3s. However, if I had in-ear monitors, and a good example would be Crinical's favorite IEM, the Campfire Audio Solaris, and yes, I have a bad sense of humor. These are extremely sensitive in-ear monitors, and I often use them. I actually still like them, and I often use them for testing the amount of hiss that DAPs such as this N3Ultra produce. So plugging it in and playing a track of dead silence, which is basically a track with nothing on it so that it activates the amplification, I could hear pretty much nothing in low gain mode. An interesting aspect was low gain mode in actually the FiiO had a larger volume range for very sensitive in-ear monitors than the N3Ultra, although I found this sufficient with getting to about, the 45-50 level on the volume for Carmen Gomez Sings the Blues, for example, and then I could go a little bit quieter for stuff that may be rock, which is more compressed. So it still had plenty of volume range for in-ear monitors, even very sensitive ones. Another aspect of that is where we should start talking about the tube modes. So we have solid state mode, as I already talked about, and then we have the classic tube mode and the modern tube mode. So of those, the standard solid state mode was maybe, I don't know, I want to call it a touch warm or whatever, but it was fine, I'd say. I'd probably say that actually it sometimes revealed maybe that, well, the DAC in this is a mid-range DAC, the AKM 4493, or a pair of them, and sometimes I feel that the reproduction of maybe the more challenging instruments, such as you have drums, cymbals, violin, and piano, sometimes weren't as good as they could be, with sometimes maybe cymbals or drums sounding a little bit maybe digital or maybe a little bit unnatural, but it was a fairly rare thing. Generally, things sounded pretty good. Depending on what I was using, I much preferred the tube modes with the N3Ultra, either the classic or the modern. Now, the classic gave more of a kind of bloomy sound to the tubes. With some in-ear monitors and headphones, that was maybe a little bit too much. Maybe it was too much kind of bloom, too many harmonics added to the sound. And I generally preferred the modern mode, which it's a very subtle tube mode, kind of similar to the Tube Mini's sound, where if you didn't compare, you wouldn't really notice that you're listening with tube amplification. Now, in terms of resolution, maybe a real challenge for the N3Ultra is this M11 Plus, and that has come down $100 to about $599, so we'll say $600, whereas the N3Ultra is about $529 last I looked. Now, the M11 Plus is generally more resolving than the N3Ultra. And by that I mean if I listen to, say, an acoustic recording in a venue, I could hear more of the subtleties of how the sound moved around the venue, or I could hear, say, in Carmen Gomez, for example, more of the subtleties of how the microphone's very close to her mouth and all those little subtleties. The note decay of instruments came through slightly better with this. Now, when it was a couple of $100 more, well, you kind of expect that, as then it was significantly more expensive. But at now less than $100 more expensive, well, actually the difference there then was synergy. So while this M11 Plus does have more resolution, at least that's what I feel, given FiiO's ability to move away from making DAPs that sound really cold and that may be a little too unpleasant, with some gear, maybe for example the E3s, I felt that it was a good synergistic match with the M11 Plus, but some headphones and in-ear monitors, I preferred the slightly warmer, if slightly less detailed sound from the N3Ultra. Actually, between the two players, that leaves it down to whether you care about having all the full features of a DAP and full Android versus something that can only play from USB or a micro SD card. I think ultimately what it will come down to is people who buy the N3Ultra will buy it because they know specifically what they want. They want that tubey sound, they don't care about having full Android, and they want something which is maybe similar to what the N3 Pro gave, but with the ability to use that balanced output with the tube mode, which is something you couldn't do with the N3 Pro. Of course, there may also be the obscure person who wants to use it as a DAC, a tube DAC to maybe say a hi-fi system, if that's the case. So that's the N3Ultra, and if you have one, maybe you're watching this review, as people sometimes do, to see what your my impressions are versus yours, please do leave a comment below with your own impressions, good or bad, of the product and your experience with it. My reviews are designed to help people decide whether to buy or not to buy a product, and any other information from actual users could be very useful. As always, thank you to PSVANE for sponsoring this video. Do check out my video on their tubes, and also thank you to all my supporters who have been enabling me to continue on with these reviews. If you'd like to support my work, do check out the link in the description, and I look forward to seeing you online.